Welcome, welcome, welcome everyone to our CDA Community Development Administration, CDBG Community Development Block Grant Capacity Building Training. We welcome our seasoned sub-recipients back to this webinar, along with some of our potentially new sub-recipients for this training. My name is Rashonda Alexander. I am City Planning Executive here on the CDA team. We have Mr. Tom Nagel, who is our Public Information Officer. Lisa Jones, one of our senior monitors, our most senior monitor, and Ruth Kenoy, our other most senior monitor, who will be leading this training. I'm sure a lot of you recognize their faces, voices, or names, and we're going to get through this PowerPoint presentation / webinar to really highlight the RFP process. And we wanted to really focus here because proposals are due on September the 7th. We are aware that we have some seasoned subrecipients. This information is not new to you. So thank you for being with us for that. It's more geared toward our newer, possibly newer contracted subrecipients. And we just want to make sure that we're very clear. If you can, go to the CDA website at this time, hit that link for the CDBG RFP for year 24, and have it either at your fingertips. Maybe you can print it really quickly or pull it up on your screen or any device so that you can kind of follow through as we work through this presentation. So I guess let's get started with bringing it up on the screen. The first thing we're going to do is run through our funding cycle. We talked about our most recent and most important date, which is September 7th, when the proposals are due. We see that Tom just dropped in the link so that you're able to log on and download the RFP. Follow along with us. So our agenda today, we're going to talk briefly about our funding cycle timeline. We're going to review our RFP sections, drill down on some common RFP hiccups, and have a space for Q&A. We really wanted to capitalize on this time. We are aware that questions during this period will be sent to the email at cdbg@stlouis-mo.gov. However, while we're here, we appreciate your time, and if we're able to answer live, we want to do that and make best use of this time together for any questions you may have. Going to our funding cycle, and next slide. Our contract period begins at the top of every year. So in January 1st through December 1st, that's our funding cycle and contract period. March 15th, the first programmatic and financial reports are due, and they'll be due on the 15th of each month. Around the first quarter, we'll have some TA visits, our technical assistance visits. They're usually for our newer subrecipients, and then also those who score higher on our risk assessments. Somewhere around July 30th, we'll send some status letters that are mailed. You all have been receiving those about now, your mid-year review letters. So you are familiar, if you are a current subrecipient, of exactly what this is. And this is basically saying, great job. You've been doing so well spending the money as we have contractually agreed, or you may have some issues. Let us know what they are so we can see if we can get you back on the right track. The third and fourth quarters of 2024, next year, we'll have some site visits with you. And then by the end of December, on the 31st, the grant cycle will be over. With it being over, we'll need you to have your final reports back to CDA by February of 2025. Now, we're going to get more into the actual webinar. We've given you your dates. I want to give you a moment to kind of take these in, maybe take a picture with your phone, and we're going to toss it over after a little more time for you to take a quick screenshot if needed. Even though it's being live recorded on YouTube, you can always go back and check it out. But we're going to toss it over to Miss Lisa Jones. You're up next, Lisa. Are you ready? Okay, well, let's.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Jones. I am a community development specialist, also known as a program monitor with CDA. This afternoon, we will be reviewing the sections of the RFP. Next slide, please. The first section we'll be reviewing is the background and national objectives. You have to read these pages very carefully to determine if your proposed activity fits within program guidelines. If the proposed activity doesn't meet a national objective, it cannot be funded. Next, please. The priorities and eligible activities section. This is one of the most important sections of the RFP. So you have to read this, review it very carefully. It identifies the annual priorities for the city of St. Louis, and if the proposed activity does not fit within an eligible priority or activity, it will not be funded. Next, please. There we go. Instructions, some tips for, excuse me, these are some tips for the instructions. Upon completion of the proposal packet, use the instruction sheet as a checklist. Especially important because it identifies conditions that, if not met, will disqualify applicants. This page provides instructions on submitting questions. You have to read the questions carefully and follow the directions. Questions will only be accepted via CDBG at stlouis-mo.gov or EGRAM support at stlouis-mo.gov. Next, please. The acknowledgement and certification section. You have to read this very carefully. It also has to be signed by an authorized signer from the organization. That would include an executive director, a board president, or any other designated person. Next, please. The organization profile. Some common mistakes made with this review, some common mistakes made with this section. The UEI number and SAM.gov issues not resolved prior to proposal submission. Helpful hint, periodically during proposal acceptance and the review period, search for your organization on SAM.gov. Verify that your SAM.gov registration is not close to expiring. If it will expire prior to funding announcements, update your registration immediately. And you should start resolving any issues as soon as possible. Next, please. This is a sample of the SAM.gov website. The unique entity identifier used in SAM.gov has changed. As of April 4th, 2022, the unique entity identifier used across the federal government changed from the DUNS number to the unique identity ID number. This is a 12-character alphanumeric ID assigned to an entity by SAM.gov. As part of the transition, the DUNS number is no longer being used. Entity registration, searching, and data entry in SAM.gov now requires use of the new unique entity ID. Existing registered entities can find their unique entity ID by following the steps at SAM.gov. New entities can obtain a unique entity ID at SAM.gov if required by completing a registration. Next, please. The organizational background in the organization narrative section. That's what we'll be discussing next. This section is all about demonstrating organizational capacity where you can showcase your organization. You review your sample rating sheet under Show Documents. Responses can significantly affect the organization's overall rating. Agency, program, and financial qualification categories are on the rating sheet. Common mistakes made: providing too much or not enough detail. Remember, be inclusive and succinct. Next, please. Additional tips: be persuasive in demonstrating organizational capacity to administer the proposed activity or activities. Proposed activities should match your organizational purpose and be reasonably related to the types of services currently provided. For example, a daycare center that provides educational services to toddlers should not request funding for an offender reentry program without adequately explaining the deviation in purpose and change in type of service. Next, please. A helpful tip: applicants should address all required licenses. For example, the City of St. Louis business license, which is required, or you must demonstrate exemption, or a daycare license. The grant administration history section, you will need a letter of recommendation from a previous funder for the organizations not currently funded by CDA, and this is optional for organizations currently funded by CDA. Next, I would like to turn this over to Ruth, and she'll talk to you about personnel.
Thank you, Lisa. I am another one of the programmatic monitors here at CDA, and I'm going to go over the personnel description under the organization narratives of the RFP. You are required to list all existing and proposed staff positions for your proposed activity. You want to provide both resumes and job descriptions. If you've got a position that's not currently filled and it's not you wouldn't need the resume, of course, but you still have to provide the job description. This would be someone we call a to be hired or a TBH position. Remember, if it's funded, your to be hired positions are going to require compliance with equal employment opportunity requirements that we have here at CDA. And we must approve that for your cost to be CDBG eligible. Next slide, please. Here's some things we see commonly that are mistakes, which would be not submitting both job descriptions and resumes in this section. Also not including all of the staff that's involved in the administration, management, and or operation of your proposed activity. For example, you may have a CFO on your staff list there, and that person is not going to be paid by CDBG funds. However, because they are involved in managing the grant process and what goes forward, that person needs to be on your personnel description and provide a resume for them. We also see people who are adding their subcontractors to this section. This is another mistake. You want to put those subcontractors in the CDBG activity budget section of the proposal under the line item, contractual or professional services. And another mistake would be that you don't follow EEO requirements for the people that you hire later that on your proposal are to be hireds. Next slide, please. Here's a tip for using EGRAMs in this section. This information that you're entering on personnel description and resumes is going to populate later on in your proposal under the the personnel schedule, which is later in the application. So if you need to make changes when you get to your personnel schedule, you're going to have to come back to this organization narrative section in EGRAMs to make those changes. Next slide, please. At this point, I'm going to go over some financial management information. This is also under the organization narrative section of the RFP. We require that you submit your most recent IRS Form 990 with your application. We've got some fiscal year ending here with your deadlines, just to alert you of what those are if you haven't done that. And if you do not have a current 990, you need to also attach a copy of an approved extension that you have received from the IRS. Not attaching this extension is a common mistake, so be sure to include it. And not entering your financial staff into the personnel description and resume section, even if they're not being paid, is another common mistake in EGRAMs. Next slide, please. Let's go over some tips to ensure that your responses demonstrate the organization's financial management system and internal controls that would lend assurance to your ability to properly manage federal funding. Also, your answers, if they're incorrect or if they are not added in this section, this can significantly impact your rating and not on the good side under the agency financial qualifications category. Common mistakes include not providing detail to support sufficient segregation of major accounting functions within your organization, or not expanding on your board of directors' oversight of the financial management of your agency. Next slide, please. Audit requirements. They're not required for everyone, but if you are required to do the single federal audit, the threshold is $750,000. This section is one you need to pay attention to because we need to see a copy of your most recently completed single federal audit. Audit reports must be filed with the Federal Audit Clearinghouse 9 months after your fiscal year end date. Next slide, please. You want to describe how you're going to ensure compliance with this audit if you need to do one. First of all, familiarize yourself with the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards. You can find this in the legislation that's noted here, which you can find online if you're not familiar with that. One common mistake would be not providing enough detail to support sufficient knowledge of the audit process, including budgeting, the cost of the audit, procurement, and selection of an audit firm, and the timely completion and submission of your report. Next slide, please. You want to describe any findings that have been issued as a result of your most recent audit and whether or not these findings have been resolved or if they're still open. Provide a brief description of each finding, including the question cost, the steps you've taken to resolve the issues, and the current status. Not providing sufficient detail that this deficiency or the concern noted in the audit report has been addressed and resolved, that can give you a lower score on your proposal. Next slide, please. You want to categorize all funding sources and expenses for the entire agency by the line item descriptions on the form. If you do not include the fiscal year beginning and end dates in this section, you're also going to be making one of our common mistakes we see on proposals. Next slide, please. Remember to submit separate proposals for each separate and distinct proposed activity. And this is going into what Lisa's going to talk about, which is the activity cover sheet. Sorry, Lisa, I've crossed the line. It's your
okay.
turn.
It's okay, Ruth. We're all in this together.
We're all in this together. Thank you.
Okay, let's talk about this activity cover sheet. This is important because organizations must submit separate proposals for each separate and distinct proposed activity. Let's go over some examples. Next slide, please. Organization XYZ would like to request funding for after-school program at 3 locations. XYZ can submit 3 separate proposals or submit 1 proposal inclusive of all the sites. At this point, you can choose which one is easier for you. Organization ABC would like to request funding for an after-school arts program and a daycare center. ABC must submit 2 separate proposals because they are 2 separate activities. Organization HIJ would like to request funding to rehab several of their rooms and provide a food pantry in the same building. HIJ must submit 2 separate proposals because they are 2 separate activities. They are not related at all. Next slide, please. For the activity cover sheet, one tip to remember is to check 1 priority and 1 eligible activity per application. And a common mistake on the activity cover sheet is not the contact is not the primary contact person for the proposed activity. So basically it's saying whomever is listed as the main contact, that's the person that CDA will contact if they have questions regarding the activity. So you want to make sure that information is correct. The next section, next please. Activity description and the funding request, very important. The CDBG amount requested be realistic and reasonable. We have a $25,000 minimum request. Some tips when asking for your request: be succinct yet descriptive. The activity name, XYZ after school program. The activity summary or mission statement should be 100 words or less, and it should include the activity name, the program's purpose, locations, if there's more than one, service area, and population and demographics targeted, and the number of people served. Next, please. Some tips when completing this section: the activity name and summary or anywhere in the proposal must not include any political or religious references. Also, if funded, the activity name and the summary will be the activity name and summary that we CDA put on the contract. So you want to make sure that it accurately describes your activity. Next, please. Common mistakes. When completing this section, activity summary does not adequately summarize the activity. The activity name has a political or religious reference or other language inappropriate for a contract name, and not including all addresses and locations for the proposed activities. Next, please. The activity description should describe the work to be performed, the services provided, and the population served. Most importantly, clearly describe your program design. It should include who, what, when, and how. If the program design is not fully explained, your score will be significantly reduced. Next, please. When you refer to the CDBG background for details on the national objectives. If funded, CDA will only reimburse for city low moderate income participants in the activity. A helpful tip: when using the area benefit national objective subcategory 1D, the number of beneficiaries under 2A will be the number of LMI individuals residing in the area. Be sure to fully describe the service area in your proposal, and this should include census tract, zip codes, and neighborhoods. Next, please. In the proposed activity and goals, the proposed activity goals and output section, allowable outputs are persons or households, and that's indicated by P or HH. The outputs should be directly related to the proposed activity. They should be measurable. CDBG reimbursements will be tied to measurable outputs or outcomes only. Tracking and evaluation is important. You should demonstrate successes at the end of the grant because HUD expects measurable, quantifiable results. Next, please. Helpful hints. Be prepared to propose and justify a per unit cost based on proposed outputs. Be realistic in your goal setting. And when determining reasonableness, analyze the cost per unit. Let's look at an example. Next, please. Okay. XYZ organization requests $200,000 for a summer program and proposes to serve 25 children for 3 months. The per child cost for the program is $8,000. The per unit cost, or the cost per child per month, is $2,667. Ask yourself, are these costs reasonable? Next, I will hand this back over to Ruth so she can talk to you about public improvement and facility activity.
Thank you, Lisa. Public improvements, facilities activities. First of all, you need to have site control, and that must be documented in the name of the entity that is applying for the proposal. If the site is city-owned, the organization should have buy-in from the municipal holding entity prior to applying for funding. Projects currently under construction or planning to be in construction, if this occurred earlier than June of this year, 2023, these projects are not eligible for CDBG funding. Next slide, please. Here are some tips. Professionally prepare a construction budget. Do not take your project out to bid. If you're funded, whoever prepares the construction budget cannot compete in the sealed bid process. Important to remember that in the procurement process, if you're funded, solicitation of a general contractor without CDA's preliminary approval will result in either having to rebid your project or your project could be rescinded of its funding. Next slide, please. All public improvements and facility activities must go through environmental review, and this can be quite lengthy. So if you have available any environmental reports already, particularly those that include sampling specimens, please provide this to CDA. If you're funded, any construction work or closing on a site acquisition without completion of this environmental review will automatically rescind your CDBG funding. If you are using multiple funding sources, remember that CDBG can muddy or taint these other funding sources. We have to keep things very separate when we're reporting that money, federal coming in for a project. So all of your funding sources need to adhere to the most stringent set of their regulations. Next slide, please. Other funding tips. You want to always be seeking to leverage CDBG funding in your budget for your proposed activity. You want to show how the CDBG funds will be leveraged and be realistic in the projections. This goes for the entire RFP, not just a facilities improvement. We are moving on to the budget now. Next slide, please. The activity budget, here are some tips in completing this section. All of your line items, the total, this should be greater than or equal to the proposed CDBG amount. Your total expenses should not be more than the total revenue. You can get local travel reimbursed at the city's rate of about 60 cents per mile. You'd want to check the website to make sure that is still the city's rate currently. Yesterday it was when I checked. If you are contracting with professional services, buying supplies, equipment, printing, all of these things, if one vendor is going to charge $10,000 or more, you've got to complete CDA's procurement process. Your personnel salaries, your timesheets, conflict of interest forms, secondary employment forms, and equal opportunity approval of new hires, if applicable, will all be required for personnel paid whole or in part with CDBG funding. Next slide, please. Some common mistakes we see in the activity budget section include the following: not including your leveraged funds in this budget if you declare them in the budget narrative, not providing a description of each line item, and including contractual workers under personnel cost instead of professional services. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about the personnel schedule. If you remember, we said that what you entered in your organization narratives, personnel, and resumes is going to be automatically transferred here. So a lot of this is going to be completed already. The form will automatically add your part-time and full-time salary totals. It also figures your FICA taxes, which we require. You'll be entering eligible benefits such as health, dental, etc. These must be less than or equal to the % of salary charged to the grant. This form is going to insert the personnel total in the activity budget page, and an error is going to show up in EGRAMs if you're over the grant amount. Next slide, please. Your actual salary per pay period should be for the entire year, not just the part of the year that you expect to use the CDBG funding. The number of pay periods needs to also reflect the entire year. Ensure that the % inserted from organizational narrative sections is correct. Sometimes people don't include the total pay periods for the year. These are typically things like once a month, which would be 12, the whole year, every other week, 26. When you don't include those, it's going to have EGRAMs sort of say, I'm not going to put this through. So you could get an error message there. Be sure to do that. And also be sure to insert the total amount you're paying for each pay period. Next slide, please. Here we've got a little snapshot of what that personnel schedule full-time looks like. You complete this information. Most of it, as I said, will be filled in when you get here. And if you look in column F, that block grant share is going to be rounded to whole dollars. Next slide, please. Here you have at the bottom of the full-time personnel schedule, the numbers that we just went over a little bit. You see those by the red bracket are the ones you're going to be plugging in. The form's going to automatically put everything else in there for you. Next slide, please. Your part-time or your per performance personnel schedules a wee bit different. Instead of doing the average pay periods for the year, you're going to enter hourly rates and total hours for the entire year. You want to make sure again that the % in your organization narrative sections is correct. And also be sure to insert the total hours for the entire year, not just what the CDBG money is going to cover. Next slide, please. Here's a little snapshot of the part-time schedule, which is almost identical to full-time, except again, we are looking at total number of annual activity hours rather than pay periods. Next slide, please. So personnel schedule tips in completing this section only include employees on here. Once again, include your contractors, your consultants on professional services in the activity budget section. All professional services that are $10,000 or more per vendor paid with CDBG money will require procurement procedures. Sometimes that also requires a contract to meet your CDBG and CDA requirements. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the final section of the RFP, which is the proposed reimbursement analysis. Lisa touched on this earlier in some of her examples. The majority of non-construction projects use per unit cost or a fixed price for a unit of service to be completed. Your outputs are going to provide the basis for the unit of service, and you should have no more than 1 unit of service per outcome or objective. You want to make sure these units of service are clear and defined and include any assumptions or calculations. Next slide. Here are some examples of typical units of service. It could be meals delivered to seniors, completed workshops for first-time home buyers, daily attendance in an after-school program, and community gardens planted in a neighborhood. Next slide. Here are some factors to consider. You want to think about the lifespan of the contract, the frequency of your reimbursements, the amount of your request, also once you get that award, what it might be, reasonable assumptions, and eligible program expenses. Your units of service must be related to your outputs. It could be people or households, but they don't have to be the same. For example, an after-school program could have persons as your output, and you could use the daily attendance as your per unit. Next slide. Let's do a few examples here to show how we get those per unit rates on the reimbursement analysis. Number one is a beautification program in a low moderate neighborhood, and you're going to request $25,000. You're planning to do 10 beautification projects. 10 is your unit of service. So you want to take that $25,000 asked, divide it by 10 units to get $2,500 as your per unit cost. Also remember, if you're using the area benefit national objective, the number of your beneficiaries will be the number of low moderate income individuals residing in the area that you serve. Next slide. Let's do one senior Meals on Wheels program with a $75,000 ask. You're going to estimate 100 total seniors. And when we do services such as these seniors may be served more than once, they're likely to be, but we are going to count each one time and call that our unduplicated number of beneficiaries. Each of these 100 seniors is going to receive 2 meals per day. That's your unit of service. You're going to provide meals 7 days a week for 50 weeks. So with this one, you want to take your 100 unduplicated seniors and multiply by 2 meals per day, by 7 days a week, and by 50 weeks to get a total of 70,000 total number of units for this activity. Take that ask of 75,000, divide it by 70,000, which gives you your $1.07 per meal. That's your per unit rate. Next slide, please. This one is an after-school program for low, moderate income youth. CDBG request is $100,000. We're going to estimate 150 total youth in the year. This means 150 individuals are going to be in the program. The program only has the capacity for 120 kids at one time. This is your daily attendance. This is going to be our unit of service. However, the average daily attendance, we're going to reduce that to 80% of our total, which will be 96 students. 180 school days in 1 year, 90 in the spring, 90 in the fall. So let's take all of that together. We've got our 96 participants. That is our daily average attendance at 80%. Multiply it by 180 school days to get your total number of units for the activity, 17,280. When you take your $100,000 ask and divide it by that number, you get the per unit rate for each student, which is $5.79. Next example, please. This is our final one, and it's a little more complicated, but sometimes we get those types of applications. So this CDBG request has $100,000, but it's going to have 2 phases of the project. We're going to estimate that 75 total clients are going to participate. 60 of these clients are going to participate in phase 1 and 50 are going to participate in phase 2 of the activity. However, we're splitting those CDBG money ask of $100,000 into 2 equal portions. So each phase is going to be funded at $50,000. Phase 1, we take our 60 clients and we take that 50,000, divide it by 60 to get 833 per unit for phase 1. With the same thing, doing 50 people at $50,000, that one's going to be $1,000 per unit for phase 2. Remember that activity should have output and specific criteria for each unit of service. Next slide. These are some common mistakes we see in EGRAMs. Not following instructions, trying to work around the system, not updating your entire proposal if you've made revisions, having multiple people using the same username, waiting until the last minute to resolve validation errors, forgetting your username and password, not uploading attachments early, not following procedures for questions and expecting an immediate response, not understanding and using the correct roles in EGRAMs, and not updating a prior year proposal. You need to just keep in mind that EGRAMs is a database and it's a very step-by-step process, but we have fabulous support there. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa so she can talk about some common RFP mistakes.
Thank you so much, Ruth. You had a lot going on with those examples. So next slide, please. Okay, common RFP mistakes when completing the application: not following instructions, making assumptions, not reviewing your own proposal in advance of submission, not fully demonstrating a need, not fully explaining the program design, not meeting a national objective and or eligible activity. Remember that any activity does not meet a national objective or an eligible activity, they will not be funded. Lack of realistic outputs and objectives, not making a reasonable ask, which means your per unit cost must be reasonable, not taking advantage of bonus points. There are bonus questions in the application, so I suggest that you complete those to get all the points necessary, and not using all of the space provided. I would like to now, this concludes the workshop. So we can move to the next slide for the question and answer section. Oh, sorry, we have some common EGRAM mistakes.
This actually is just a couple of web links for you to get more information about EGRAMs. There is a video, and especially if you haven't used the database before, we suggest that you go to this video, and it will provide 7 different steps and slides with additional information to talk about the CDBG application. Next slide.
Do we have any questions?
We have one question so far in the Q&A from Stephanie. Is there a maximum request amount per individual proposal / activity?
Mm-hmm.
There is not, but if you ask for an amount that does not seem reasonable for what you're going to use the money, that would be something that could get you a lower score, because we have to consider CDBG funds are limited. We also have a cap on that from Congress for the next couple of years. So we try to get as many individuals who need the funding some sort of support, but there is no maximum request amount.
Great. And there's multiple ways to ask questions. You can throw them in the chat or in the Q&A, or if you raise your hand, you can ask a question live and I will unmute you. These will also be recorded and posted on the CDA's website in the section for this year's CDBG RFP. I see we also have several CDA staff on the call. Welcome. If you have any comments or questions that might be helpful for the agencies that you work with, or for any newcomers, feel free to raise your hand or get in the chat, and we'll respond to your comments or questions. Rashonda, Ruth, Lisa, are there any
Yes.
questions, comments, observations that you have that perhaps we didn't cover from the presentation, or any things you just want to highlight again?
Yeah, I would like to highlight that please review your application before submitting it. It's important that we understand your activity and what you're trying to do. And the more information you give us and the more defined it is, the better chance we have of rating your application more accurately. So that's my tip.
Great, great. Rashonda, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I do see that Goal has a question. Is it a must
Oh,
that contracted money should be expended within a year?
It's not a must, but we don't guarantee that there will be an extension on the funding. So we suggest that you do not ask for more money than you can spend in that contract year.
Funds have been recaptured for non-spending. So as Ruth stated, I would encourage all of our applicants to be realistic and reasonable, and all of the other terms listed in the webinar, to make sure that you're able to use these funds as you've stated and as you've contractually agreed. I mean, this has been fun and full of
yeah,
information.
this is great.
We appreciate everybody who did make it to the training today. Thank you for your time and attention.
Yes, unless there's any questions, we'll toss it to Rashonda with some closing remarks. These slides will be posted on the CDA's webpage that hosts the 2024 CDBG information, and this video, which is streaming live on YouTube, and I'll put the link in the chat here. We'll also add a link to that on the same website on stlewis-mo.gov/CDA. And so if you would like to watch this again or share it with a friend or a coworker, we'll have it available for you. So I don't see any final questions. So Ruth, Lisa, thank you so much for taking us through. And Rashonda, do you have anything you'd like to close with?
We just want to remind you that proposals are due on September the 7th. We want to, again, express our appreciation for our subrecipients on behalf of our Executive Director, Noel Pfeffer, and our wonderful team that continues to do this work for the city and for our subrecipients and beneficiaries and contractors and all those who work together to get these funds out to our low, moderate individuals and others. We appreciate it. And let's see what you have for us this year. Hopefully it's something fresh, fun, and compliant. So
Yes.
see you on the other side, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.